part of this aviation fever was spurred by the fact that he flew above French villages in a balloon, and he took the first aviation photographs, and people could now see the world differently than they'd ever seen it before. He also took pictures of the sewers of Paris using the first flash, and he interviewed a very old French veteran, took pictures of him, and wrote about him, creating what today would be known as photojournalism. Now, he was the center of three men. They were known as the helicopter triumvirate, the people that were just fanatic about helicopters. The other one was the Vicomte Gustave de Poton de Amecourt. And the third one was Gabriel de la Landelle. Now, Landelle is a fantasy painter and illustrator. We remember him primarily for two reasons. One, he'll create fanciful paintings, but he coins a word. The word's called aviation. D'Amecourt is, we remember him for two reasons. One is that he is the man who coins the term helicopter, from the Greek spiral and wing, helix, helikos, and pteron. This is what he's also remembered for. This is actually a steam engine. And it's an attempt to create a vertical aircraft. Note it's also coaxial. Again, you've got to deal with the issues of torque. The rotors moved in opposite directions. It is a steam engine. It did not fly, but it's displayed in the Museum of Aviation in France because, and by the way, it had no generator. It actually heated the water. The water was actually contained, the steam was actually contained in these coils. But it is remembered for a major advance in dealing with one of the issues of vertical flight, that of the weight-to-power ratio, because this is the first engine that's created made of this new metal called aluminum. But we remember him primarily because he coins the word helicopter and because he founds a journal that it goes through a name change. The name of that journal, of course, is the Journal of Aviation. It is the first publication to use that term. It is the oldest publication to use that term. He also forms a society to promote a helicopter. The secretary of that society is a French author by the name of Jules Verne. Jules Verne, first of all, puts Nadar as a character in one of his novels. He refers to D'Amecourt in one of his novels as a pioneer in aviation, and he publishes a book with a fanciful helicopter in it called Robur the Conqueror in French, known in English as the Clipper of the Clouds. We, in fact, would forget that, except for the fact that in Russia, we're going to see there's a young man by the name of Igor Sikorsky who gets interested in helicopters. And he claims that what gets him interested in helicopters is Leonardo da Vinci and the book, The Clipper in the Clouds. Now, this is interesting. This is actually from an 1880 poster, but it's dated 1874. It is by a man named Achenbach in Germany. And for the longest time, this was considered significant because it was the first to show a different way of dealing with torque, the tail rotor. You can see it here, which, by the way, ultimately is what you're going to find out here. But we're not there yet. This, by the way, was known. This thing, was called a Fliegend Wurstkessel, known as a flying sausage boiler, because of the double enclosed boiler was apparently used somehow in sausage making. And I've always subscribed to the theory that you don't watch legislation or sausage being made, so that is the full extent of my knowledge. Again, Eugene Libator has done extensive analysis on this, and 2 years ago presented a paper that strongly suggests that this is not the case, that this in fact has been mistaken. This is not actually a tail rotor. It's actually a thruster that can be rotated to propel the aircraft from the back, as well as to keep it from going left and right. And this is some of his analysis. This is within the last 2 years. Libator points out that you have a gearing here and a gearing here, and there's the, he, by the way, maintains that this young man is actually courting that young woman. How he gets there, I don't know. This is his close-up. He says the turbine-powered tail rotor. Here in the bottom is the gearing which actually turns it, and here is the steam which actually powers it. We can't then go from and assert that this, in fact, is the very first tail rotor. But we're going to get closer to it. This doesn't look like much. This is the creation of an Italian, Enrico Forlanini. This is from 1877, and it actually flew. It is a, okay, sorry, wrong button. Okay. This is what's actually inside that cylinder. It's a two-cylinder steam engine. But again, if you go back and you look at it, in order to deal with the weight, Forlanini did not put any boiler. The steam is actually contained in this. It is screwed on, and it powers this aircraft. But it flew. And it becomes the first mechanically powered, not rubber band powered, but the first mechanically powered aircraft in history. Now, you were shown this before, and again, I have to correct Lawrence. This, in fact, is not a powered aircraft where somebody's going to pedal their way to success. But this is an interesting aircraft. It's from Monaco. And it is from 1905. It is the creation of Maurice Léger. And I'm putting it in here because it always gets overlooked. I mean, you're going to see one picture of it. It looks very ungainly. It was powered by electricity. So it was tethered to the ground. And that's why helicopter historians tend to ignore it, because it was tethered to the ground. This is what it actually looked like. The interesting thing about it, that if you don't overlook it, this is Léger in the center, but this is another interesting man. This is Dr. Jules Richard. He is chairman of the Monaco Oceanographic Institute, a position later that Jacques Cousteau would occupy for many years. The reason that I put this in is the fact that witnessed by, and this is again in 1905, witnessed by Prince Albert of Monaco and attested to by several other witnesses, this actually lifted this man off the ground for 15 seconds. It is the first rotary wing aircraft, albeit tethered to the ground with an electric cable, to lift a human being off the earth. And Dr. Richards deserves to be remembered as the first helicopter passenger in history. Yes?
Are they fabric covered?
Yes. In fact, they're covered with aluminum. He designed a bigger one. This is his two-passenger model. This was actually constructed in 1907. This is a museum model of what it looked like. It didn't survive the first flight. It actually tipped over. But if you go back and you look at the construction, I mean, this is what it looks like. It's actually quite interesting because it has all the motors on top. By the way, this is not the strangest craft we're going to look at. There are stranger. This is a museum model, but I think that the Léger helicopter deserves to be remembered. Even though it was tethered to the ground, it could actually lift a human being. But now we're getting some very serious. Now, why? Because we're understanding more and engines are getting better. This is the Breguet. The Breguet René gyroplane. He coins the word. And Louis Charles Breguet's family, of course, was the famous watchmaking family. They'd been in business by this point 132 years. They made watches for people like Napoleon Bonaparte and Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. They'd been around a long time. Here's what Breguet looked like. Well, I'm sorry, let me come back to this photo. I keep touching the wrong button. This is what his aircraft looked like. Again, it's a cruciform with 4 sets of rotors. The engine is the center. They're powered by belts linking to all the rotors. These two would clockwise. These two would be counterclockwise. This was his, the Breguet aircraft. This is the famous photo and the claim upon which it is made as the first helicopter. And you clearly see it here off the ground. Unfortunately, if you read Jean Boulet's book, Helicopters Before Helicopters, Boulet quotes, he did interviews and he quotes he goes back and looks at actual documents. And he quotes an eyewitness account of a discussion of this flight with Breguet's chief pilot. And the account is that every time we'd mention this day, the pilot would nudge me in the ribs. Breguet would nudge the pilot in the ribs, and say they aren't holding it down, they're holding it up. There is very, very serious doubt as to whether this aircraft ever flew. Breguet designs a second one. This aircraft actually could fly, but it never got more than 15 feet off the ground, and it's not considered a true helicopter because it also has wings. You can see the wings here, and at the very best, it's a converted plane, and some of the lift being generated was, as we're going to see, being generated by the wings itself. This is something that I want you to look at, because one of the problems, if you remember, I said that the problem with a rotor as it goes around is it exerts gyroscopic force. And it's not even force. I mean, consider an aircraft, helicopter moving through the air. When the rotor is going this way, if the rotor is going 100 miles an hour and the helicopter is going 100 miles or 200 miles an hour, that rotor, as it travels here, is actually traveling 300 miles an hour. When it travels this way, it's now going the opposite direction. It's only traveling 100 miles an hour. That creates an imbalance of force. The way that we're ultimately going to deal with it is actually found in this forgotten patent. These are two Hungarians, Josef Bartha, it's Matazar and Bartha, Max Bartha and Josef Matazar. This is actually the German patent from 1913. It was patented in 1912 in England. Now, the Patent Search Service was not such that we'd think that anybody was actually aware of it. But they've actually solved the problem. And it's a solution that we're going to see. It's going to be rediscovered by Juan de la Cierva in Spain. It is the key to the early successful rotary flight. It's a hinge right here. This is a hinged rotor. Actually, it's an offset hinge that allows the rotor to flap, what is known as coning, so that as the rotor goes around, it will self-correct. The wings will the rotor will actually tilt up or down to equalize the force. Now, as we're going to see, Cierva is going to add one more thing to that, and that allows the rotor to go back and forth, to jiggle, lead-lag hinging, to reduce the torsional force on the root, because otherwise, eventually the rotor has the potential of metal fatigue and breaking off. But what I want you to see is that this was around, in fact, actually, this is actually a hanging stick control that looks like it could have tilted the rotor. That discovery will not come into rotary wing aircraft until the mid-1930s. It's going to be key. But this was around. Auto-rotation, the fact that if you take a helicopter rotor and you have enough air coming up through the bottom, and it has the right angle on the wing, the right incidence on the rotor, the air coming through will actually generate lift. Helicopters fly by pushing down. A freewheeling rotor, what we'll call the autogyro, flies by lifting up. That's a simplification, but everyone who flies a helicopter knows this, because if a helicopter gets in trouble, that's exactly what you hope you can do. You pray to God you can do. You auto-rotate down. That auto-rotation was actually patented, to the extent that you can patent it, by Charles Bernard in 1902. This is 1912. So the various bits and pieces are out there, but nobody's put them together. These people, by the way, will not put them together. It will take a new eye. Now, there are a number of claims as to what was the first helicopter. By the way, the Breguet helicopter, I said that was also the Breguet Richer helicopter. Just so you don't think that this was a ne'er-do-well, engineer, son of a wealthy family, kind of fooling around. Charles Richer would win the Nobel Prize for medicine in 1913 for discovering anaphylactic shock. So, I mean, we're talking about some, pretty heavyweight people here. Again, I refer you to Jean Boulet's book, quoting the chief pilot. It's a direct quote. In fact, it's highly unlikely that flew. This, however, has a different claim. This is Paul Cournot's helicopter, and the claim has been made by the French that this is the first helicopter, and in fact, 2007 was the 100th anniversary. That is a highly suspect claim. Cournot was the eldest of 15 children. He began experimenting with helicopters. This is what he comes up with. Again, counter-rotating, front and back. You have an engine here. It's controlled by belts. Very, very inefficient in terms of generating enough power, and that's one of the problems. Now, he had he built a model, and the model flew. and he knew to actually get witnesses. And he got affidavits that people saw the model fly. Supposedly, this model flies in November 13th, 1907. Supposedly, it lifts. The claim is that it lifts with him in it as a pilot, lifts 1 foot off the ground. The problem is that there was no witnessing of this. There was no attestation. He also claims later that it took Cournot and his brother 4.5 feet off the ground. This has been called into question by engineering analysis by Gordon Leishman of the University of Maryland, the Martin Minta Distinguished Professor, as well as by Eugene Liberatore, also an engineer. They've cast doubt, and Boulay, that with all of the weight and the fuel, that this actually could, in fact, have lifted off the ground. There was no, there's no witness attestation to it. And in fact, when Gordon Leishman actually visited and did research, and then eventually a translation was published of Cournot's notebooks, for that day there is no notation of a manned flight. In fact, the speculation is that at most the helicopter would lift a couple of wheels off the ground. And maybe with the speculation is that with the jolt it would actually jump off the ground, a hopper, but that at most it would only keep 2 wheels off the ground. And in fact, this past year, a photo has surfaced of exactly that. There is him sitting in it. This is the photograph that at best shows, you can't see it because it's not the rear wheels off the ground. The front wheels are not off the ground. So despite the French claims, there is serious doubt as to whether this was the Cournot helicopter could in fact be looked on as the first helicopter. And in fact, if it was the first helicopter, it clearly never got out of ground effect, and it certainly was not a controlled flight. Now, this is generally skipped over. This, you know who this is, of course, Glenn Curtiss. But I want to show you because of this. Glenn Curtiss in 1908 lends his motor that he had invented. He used it on his motorcycle. He will take it out. This is in May. He'll take it out and put it in his aircraft and win the Scientific American Prize for the flights of 1908, 1909, and 1910. This is the Williams helicopter. And I'm spending time on it because, first of all, this is a fascinating guy. Williams is 67 years old. He wears a Chinese hat. He's described as a Fu Manchu mustache, but that may be a later attribution. Glenn Curtiss lends him his motor, and he puts it on this. Now, this does not look like much, except for the fact that we actually have a photograph taken by Glenn Curtiss, and you have an attestation that this actually lifted an individual off the ground. With him as him piloting, it actually lifted a human being off the ground. It is the first lifting by a rotary wing aircraft. In fact, actually, shortly after the Wright brothers in 1903, it's the first lifting of a human being in America. Now, the interesting thing is that the witnesses, it's witnessed by Alexander Graham Bell, Augustus Post, Lieutenant Selfridge. You know who Selfridge was. 3 months later, he'll become the first person to die in an airplane accident. This is the Williams helicopter, and it is, again, I put it here only because Williams is the first person to lift, this is in Hammondsport, New York. He's the first person to lift a human being off the ground with rotary wing flight in America. This does not stop him, though. He realizes that his problem is he doesn't have enough power. So who does he seek out? Well, he seeks out someone that we all know, Emil Berliner. Emil Berliner, a Jewish immigrant to America, becomes a kitchen scientist. He invents a microphone that he will sell to Alexander Graham Bell. His fortune will actually come from inventing the phonograph. He and his brother will found a company in Germany called Deutsches Grammophon. He also invents, by the way, the parquet floor and acoustic tile. But we're interested in him because of this. He invents a rotary engine. And that's what brings, the next year, that's what brings Williams down to Berliner. And Berliner now gets interested in helicopter design. This, of course, is the Berliner Williams helicopter. It is not much better than the first one. And Williams, The official helicopter's history said that Williams disappears. However, and bear in mind, he would have been at that point in his late 80s. There is speculation that it was actually a Williams design in 1924. We have these photos from 1924. It's a platform with a motor. We actually have a photo of it working. Whether it lifted someone off the ground, we don't know. This is a Williams. Those, by the way, when you see those photos, there's no attribution. Nobody knows anything about them. But this is a Williams pattern diagram that looks suspiciously like that design. More importantly is this man that almost nobody's ever heard of. You know who he is. That's Jens Christian Ellenhammer in a place called Norway. And Ellenhammer is the last of the three that can make a claim to being, again, the first helicopter. And he has a much more credible claim. This is what his machine looked like. Here's, of course, his conceptual drawing. The interesting thing about the Ellenhammer machine is that we know that it actually flew because we have this photo. This is from 1914. And it actually shows it hovering. And apparently it could hover for up to 15 minutes. It clearly, the person standing next to it is not holding it up, but probably steadying it. At most, it could fly in what we would call ground effect. It doesn't appear that it could go anywhere. Let's go back a little bit. This is Boris Yuryev. Boris Yuryev is a helicopter aviation pioneer in Russia. When he dies, and he dies in the 1950s, he will be lauded as the father of Soviet rotary wing aircraft aviation. This is obviously during World War II. I put Boris Yuryev in because of a failure. This is Yuryev's design from 1902. It does not succeed, but the reason that I put it in is that you can clearly see in the patent now he is one of the first, he's not the first, but certainly the first scientifically to articulate now using a tail rotor. And that is his contribution, at least at this point. This is what his aircraft looked like. Obviously, the motor's not been put on it. It suffered some mishaps and some developmental issues, and eventually the Russian Revolution, the communists stopped it because, what? 10 minutes? You told me I had more.
10 minutes.
Okay. All right. Well, you told me I had more time. Okay. These are failures of. Is that for all my presentations or just one? Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to look at this. This is Sikorsky's failures. He will return to rotary wing aircraft. This is done in Austro-Hungary. This is an attempt to create something that will actually go up in the air. Note that there's a cab. You can't see it's black up here where the pilot sets above the aircraft. The problem is this is a dummied photo. Note this thing never flew with a human being in it. But it's the first aircraft constructed to a military specification. Berliner's back. This is the Berliner helicopter. This thing actually flies. This is the son, Henry Berliner. Berliner, not terribly successful. He now tries a bi-wing. He goes to a tri-wing and eventually disappears. Has no major effect on helicopter development. This is Omichon. Omichon is a Frenchman. This is his aircraft. Everybody poo-poos it, and you will see the photos of it flopping around. Everybody ignores the fact that the balloon could only lift the man. The aircraft is actually generating enough lift to lift the aircraft. This is the second version. Again, we're familiar with the pattern. It actually flew. It gets the first official helicopter record. This is Raul Pateras Pesquera. He is an Argentinian. He's working in France in the 1920s. This is his aircraft. It could actually hover. Pesquera actually changes the blades, and he can actually tilt the rotor forward. As you're going to hear, that is collective and cyclical control. It is the beginnings of a modern helicopter system, and he is the first one to recognize that if the helicopter has to come down, it will come down by auto-rotation. Now, this ungainly thing is the Debusat helicopter. It has the distinction of being the Army's first helicopter. The Army invested $200,000 in it. They ultimately concluded that it cost too much, delivered too little, and was too complex. The evaluation of this helicopter, and it actually did fly, the evaluation of this helicopter is that the Army should probably look at a single rotor system. Hint, hint, Igor Sikorsky's coming. This is the aircraft actually flying, carrying 3 other people, 1, 2, 3. It would actually fly, could lift 4 people. This is Corradino d'Ascagno. This actually will hold a record in 1930, a coaxial helicopter. I put it in only because d'Ascagno will go on to invent and be famous for the Vespa motor scooter. And this is the I think it's the Hungarian Asboth. Again, a helicopter that will hold some records. What was happening in Spain was this man, Juan de la Cierva, born in 1895, the son of a Spanish grandee who served in the Spanish government. In 1935-1936, he will personally be responsible for smuggling Francisco Franco back into Spain from exile. This is his first creation, a glider that he builds as a child with 2 friends. It almost kills one of them. This is an aircraft that they assembled. It was called the Red Crab because of the red dye. Unfortunately, the red dye is water soluble, so it eventually will dissolve in the rain. This is built from a French aircraft that crashes. They rebuild it. It is considered the first aircraft built in Spain, and Juan de la Cierva and his buddies are considered the fathers of Spanish aviation. There's Juan, young man. This is their second aircraft. It's a monoplane. It doesn't fly very well. This is the one we're interested in. He decides in 1919 to build a 3-engine bomber, enter a competition. You can't appreciate the size of this until you actually see it. This is a huge aircraft. They hire an Army pilot to fly it. The pilot's on the first flight coming around, stalls, and crashes. And this is the moment of genius and innovation. Because Cierva asked, why does an airplane crash? Well, you know why it crashes. Because the air is not going over the wing fast enough. It reaches stall speed. It's not generating enough lift. So Cierva begins to look at the wing. And he sees, people knew about stalling, but he sees a wing differently than anybody else. Because he now says, what happened if we decouple the speed of the wing from the speed of the aircraft? His answer is a rotor on top, which, as you were told, is nothing more than 4 wings, that can now freely go around, and the speed which they go through the air is now independent of the speed of the aircraft. He knows that this will fly because he's experimented with models. This is his first one, the attempt, again, coaxial aircraft. It doesn't work very well because the rotors interfere with each other. You can see, this is actually the 3rd one they build, but the 2nd one they fly. It doesn't work very well because of centrifugal force. This is the 2nd one built, the 3rd one flown. It doesn't fly very well, but this one does. Why? Because he begins to think about, why does the small model work and the big one doesn't? And he decides that the small model works because the rotors are made of rattan, and they're flexible, and they can bend. And let me tell you, the national Spanish legend is that he has this inspiration of flapping rotors while watching Don Quixote. Not true. The family distinctly remembers that it was Aida, and last time I looked at Aida, there are no windmills. And if you see a pyramid with a windmill on it, you're in a very strange production of Aida. But he adds a flapping hinge. This is on the 19th of. This is on the 17th of January, 1923. It's the first film. It actually flown on the 7th while making a hop across the field by Alejandro Spencer Gomez, his first rotary wing pilot. You can see the models start getting bigger. They start getting faster. The question is, how do you spin up the rotor? So here, this is from the Getty collection. You've got people wrapping a cable around, and the idea is they would pull on it to spin up the rotor. Otherwise, you taxi it around the field. Some bright guy gets an idea that, well, let's wrap the cable around and stake it in the ground, and then you'll just derive, you'll run down the field. And they try it. Unfortunately, the cable snaps out, springs forward, just misses decapitating the pilot. Okay. In 1925, it's beginning to catch notice. Note, you still have wings, stub wings, because you need the control surfaces. This is the C6. Now we're getting a little bit bigger and better. Here it is. This is significant because it's now flying in England. 1925, Cierva moves to England and establishes his autogyro company. In 1928, he becomes a pilot, and he's landing at Le Bourget. This is the first rotary wing aircraft and he took a passenger to fly the English Channel. In 1928, however, an American comes. He'd been there in 1925. He now comes back, Harold Pitcairn. You know him here. This, by the way, is, he looks at this aircraft that flew the English Channel. This is the C-8. Pitcairn orders one, but he wants the same engine that Charles Lindbergh had. He wants the right engine. So it's the C-8W. That aircraft comes to America. Here it is flying over the Bryn Athyn Cathedral. It is given its 418. It's the first rotary wing aircraft in America. Now, this is not that, but this is what Pitcairn does. He flies it against biplanes to see about performance parameters. I throw this in only because it was done at Roosevelt Field, which is about half a mile from my university. Here's Orville Wright again now, come to inspect it at Anacostia Naval Air Station. It's advancing. It's beginning to get some publicity in Europe. This is now the model that we're going to look at. This is the PCA-2, again flying over the Bryn Athyn Cathedral, but we're not quite there yet. The C-8W is requested by the Smithsonian. It's flown to the mall. Here it's being accepted in the Smithsonian collection. It is now out at Silver Hill. It needs restoration. It is the first rotary wing aircraft in America. Sierra comes in 1929. He's flying his new aircraft. Note the box tail. The idea was that it would force the prop wash back up into the rotor and spin it up. It is an unsuccessful solution. This is taken from this museum right out here. And this is the PCA-1A. It's the second experimental aircraft that Pitcairn builds in 1929 and early 1930. It is a wonderful restoration except for the propeller. The propeller, it never had a three-bladed propeller. In 1930, October, November, they're now flying this new aircraft, the PCA-2. Here it's flying over Grant's Tomb, Riverside Cathedral. That is the third experimental model that he builds, the PCA-1B. It no longer survives. Here is it flying over the Florida Everglades. Here it is flying over the incomplete George Washington Bridge that was being built. Notice there's no roadbed. Here it is flying over 6th Avenue and around 6th Avenue and Wall Street. An architect tells me it's flying through the airspace that will later be occupied by the World Trade Center. New York Piers, it gets on Aero Digest. And on April 2nd, it gets ATC, it gets certified, certification 410. It's the first certified rotary wing aircraft in America. On April 8th, Amelia Earhart will fly it to the first altitude record of an autogyro, and on April 22nd, it will land at the White House, becoming the first rotary wing aircraft to land at the White House. That day, President Hoover will present Harold Pitcairn and his associates, and they're standing in the background, with the Collier Trophy, a replica of which is sitting right out here. And of course, then it's the first aircraft to take off. Pitcairn tries to sell this during the Depression by promoting it for country clubs and golf clubs. The Dude Ranch, it's almost the last scene that you will see when the wealthy playboy lands it in the 1934 film. It happened one night. He lands it at the country club. He doesn't get the girl. For publicity, Amelia Earhart embarks on a national tour, and she's going to make the first transcontinental flight. Unfortunately for her, this man, Johnny Miller, beats her cross country by about 8 days. Here's Miller landing in Glendale. Here's Amelia Earhart there. She's there like 7 days later. Supposedly, she gets out of her aircraft and says, "I'll bet you've never seen one of these." And they said, "One came through a couple days ago." Okay. Pitcairn, the Champion Spark Plug Company, embarks on they send it to South America. Here is at Chichen Itza. It captures the fancy, by the way, it couldn't hover, and it couldn't lift that much, by the way. One of the problems was Pitcairn tries to sell it during the Depression for $15,000 when you could buy a used aircraft for $1,500. But fanciful, I just love this cover. Sierra comes back in 1931. They pick him up. They're taking off here from a pier in New York. It was a press thing. This is a drawing from 1929 that I actually found in an archive. It's Wanda LaSierva's conception of a pusher autogyro. That will actually be built in 1931 by a company in Detroit. Its significance, it's out at the Hiller Museum. Its significance is that it is the first rotary wing aircraft autogyro with a pusher engine on it. They received from Philadelphia the Scott Medal from the Franklin Institute. The military looks at it. The Navy has one, the Marine Corps have one. They take it to Nicaragua. They find that it can carry too little. It doesn't give enough bang for the buck, if you will. But it can land on an aircraft carrier. It does fire spotting duties in New Jersey. The Detroit News buys one. That one, by the way, is in the Henry Ford Museum. It's actually red. This is actually blue. This is Ann Strawbridge. She will eventually become a pilot, but it's flown for the back seat, so she is not a pilot here.